So you guys have watched a few TED Talks so far, and you're pros at answering questions by this point. I've got another one for you. How many people here have read the book that this pigeon and that question are from? Lots of people. Yeah, it's a childhood classic. Mo Willems lives in Northampton. That's a fun fact for you all. So we all know that the answer to can the pigeon drive the bus is no. You should never let a pigeon drive a bus. That would go horribly. What if the pigeon asked you a different question, though? What if the pigeon asked you, hey, can I pilot a tactical missile in war? And you're probably thinking, no, of course a pigeon can't pilot a tactile missile in war because they can't even drive a bus. How are they going to do this? However, if you are B.F. Skinner of the FBI during World War II, the answer would actually be yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Rotunno, and this is Don't Let the Pigeon Live a Happy Life in defense of Columba Livia. So B.F. Skinner was this scientist working for the FBI in World War II, and he was able to figure out that pigeons had remarkable abilities which made them ideal for piloting missiles internally. They can recognize a target if they are trained to distinguish it, so enemy versus ally, and they are able to remember these targets for years in the future. We had already been using pigeons for homing and for messaging years prior, but this was a new development in technology. Using these three circles that you can see here, the pigeons could tap at their enemy target and essentially maneuver the missile into an enemy territory. Of course, this came at great sacrifice to the pigeon. They were inside the missile, so when it exploded, so did they. However, this just represents one continuation in our millennia-long undying loyalty to pigeons and with pigeons. Let's take a look back in history. In ancient Egypt, pigeons were used as important ceremonial and ritual symbols, and they were also food. In ancient Rome, pigeons represented deities and were also used as status symbols. They were also used in war in order to deliver messages about arriving foes. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they were bred to be pedigreed pets. They were prestigious, they were kept for their companionship, and we really, really loved them. In World War I, perhaps the most famous usage of pigeons, I know Ms. Lanham is excited to hear this one, pigeons delivered messages from enemy territory in order to allow forces to carry out rescue operations. This pigeon right here is named Cher Ami, the most famous one. That name means dear friend, and he delivered a message while shot through the foot that allowed a massive rescue operation of a battalion encircled by German forces. So, pigeons clearly don't enjoy the same status today that they once did. We deter them from the rooftops they once adorned with hostile spikes. We kill them in mass quantities with poisons like strychnine. Sometimes we just straight shoot them or cudgel them to death. In fact, the US Department of Agriculture is estimated to kill about 60,000 pigeons per year. The pigeon pest control industry is worth $381 billion. That's more than the GDP of a small country. I think we should be asking ourselves, if we're investing so heavily into managing pigeons, is there really a justification for why we hate them so much? Being that we have such a long-standing history with them, what happened to change our opinions? Well, obviously, it wasn't always like this in cities. In fact, in the early 1900s, the pigeons were not the problem. Pigeons were considered gentle creatures, my apologies. They were seen as pets or as attractions. Pigeon shooting was actually banned in 1901 because it was seen as being too cruel. Sparrows, this bird right here, were the real issues. When pigeon hunting was banned, people suggested replacing the pigeons with the sparrows. And so eventually pigeons had to take the place of sparrows as world's most hated bird. So how did that happen? Well, there's a couple of factors that contribute to our little sad pigeon here. First, there's this concept of imaginative geographies, which I'll explain in a second. It's not actually as complicated as it sounds. And second, there is the utility versus threat problem. So a couple things happened in conjunction in the mid-1900s, 1950s onwards, that made us hate pigeons and that have given them this insane reputation today that may not be an accurate representation of their environmental impact. So imaginative geography is just this concept that there is a separation between civilization and the wild. For humans, there is a boundary between nature and man, and that boundary shouldn't be crossed. Pigeons should not exist in cities. The city is the place where nature is not, unless we have invited it in. Everything needs to be under our control. So to illustrate that concept, I have this quote from Colin Jerelmack, who's the leading expert in pigeon-wildlife relations in urban areas. He says, "We cut out little squares in the concrete, and that's where the trees belong. We don't like it when grass and weeds begin to grow through cracks in the sidewalks because that's nature breaking out of those boundaries that we want to keep it in." So imaginative geography just means we don't want pigeons in our cities. To further illustrate this concept with the help of the pigeon, I have this little diagram here. The red circles are everywhere we would want pigeons or wildlife to exist within cities. Parks, trees, dovecotes, any kind of construction that is made for them and not for us. Of course, pigeons trample all over this and do whatever they want. You know, they exist in big squares, on sidewalks, they crap on all of our heads. It's really not a fun situation to be in, and it leads to what many people perceive to be overcrowding of cities with pigeons. But is this truly the case? No. Actually, pigeons exist at 50% of the carrying capacity of urban habitats, which means out of all of the pigeons that could be supported by the environmental resources of an urban habitat, only 50% are, and that's an incredibly low number. Most populations hover around 85 or 90%. So what else is going on here? We have this encroachment of our imaginative geographies, right? But then we also have a sharp decline in the utility of pigeons in the post-World War I period, right? We have been living among pigeons for thousands of years at this point, so it doesn't really make sense that all of a sudden we woke up one day and said, I actually really don't want them on my streets. A contributing factor to our hatred of pigeons is the fact that radio technology and long-range wireless technology began developing rapidly after World War I. That means we didn't need pigeons anymore to deliver our messages. We didn't need them in war. And even though some experiments like the World War II missile one were attempted with pigeons, they weren't really heralded as these heroes like they were before, right? In the World War I period, there were constant articles being published by the New York Times about how pigeons were heroes, naming them by name, describing their efforts, and then giving them obituaries once they died. However, once we couldn't use pigeons for our purposes anymore, either in war or in the house, as radio became more prominent in the house during the 1920s, we just kind of stopped caring about them. This was also exacerbated by the fact that CAFOs, concentrated animal feedlot operations, became far more effective at providing people with meats like chicken, beef, and pork than pigeons. People didn't need pigeons to provide them food anymore, and they didn't need to cook pigeons in restaurants because you could mass produce meat. So their utility now is virtually zero. Another compounding factor is their threat. On October 1st, 1963, the New York Times published an article citing the chief mycologist of the New York Health Department. This mycologist, Dr. Littman, had said that 2 deaths related to a type of meningitis known as psittacosis, or ornithosis, that's pretty much just a bird-contracted disease, had been caused by pigeons. Now, this guy was completely wrong. They were caused by parrots, as they always had been and still continue to be. But widespread panic kind of diffused throughout New Yorkers and across cities in the world because people started to think, okay, they're encroaching on our spaces, we don't have any use for them, and now they pose a threat to us. What are we going to do about that? Clearly, the answer to what are we going to do about that is kill thousands of them every year, and we understand that with this schema right here. This little chart kind of plots our ideas of how we perceive animals based on 2 axes: how useful they are to us and how threatening they are to us. So we don't really care about the cautious or neutral category, right? Poses no threat and is useless, or is useful but poses a threat. What we care about are the positive and the hostile categories. Because pigeons are useless and pose a threat, or they have been presented in that way to us, we view them as hostile and want to get rid of them. In the past, pigeons were both useful and seemed to pose no threat, and technically they still don't pose a threat, but we'll get to that in a second. So our perception of them was positive. So how did we get to this idea of rats with wings? Well, the rats with wings moniker was actually adopted by a New York City commissioner in about 1960. He thought that due to their propensity for spreading disease, they were no better than the sewer rats in New York City. And this stuck up until this day. So here I have some statistics for you. Because if we're going to consider killing pigeons based on whether or not they're dirty and spread diseases, we should confirm whether that's actually true. On the left here, we have 17% of these animals being carriers of zoonotic diseases, so diseases that spread from humans to animals. There are 110 diseases that can spread from this animal to us. The infection rate is rare for these animals. It's extremely low. On the right, I have a different animal. This animal has at least 50% of its population being carriers of at least one type of zoonotic disease. There are 150 plus diseases this animal can spread to us, and the infection rate is much higher because of the ways we interact with them. If anyone wants to take a guess as to what's on the left and what's on the right, you can feel free to, but I'm just going to let you know it might surprise you. On the left, we have pigeons. And on the right, we have dogs, these things that 65% of humans live with every day and that are supposed to be man's best friend. They spread more diseases than pigeons do. They spread diseases at a higher rate than pigeons do. And the diseases they spread exist within their populations at a higher rate than in pigeons. This 50% figure is only relating to parasitic infections, which means that that's only a third of the potential infectious diseases that a dog could harbor. So the fact that 50% of them have these parasites is pretty damning. So pigeons are not harmful in the disease sense. We don't really need to give them a bath, as Mo Willems suggests in his book, The Pigeon Needs a Bath. But they're also not harmful in an invasive species sense, right? We just heard from Callie and Allie telling us about the dangers of invasive species. I see her turn around over there. But pigeons are not invasive to cities because cities are unique ecosystems in their own rights. They play a discrete ecological role, they fulfill a niche. Here we have percentages for how much of peregrine falcons' diets come from pigeons in urban centers. Peregrine falcons are keystone species in urban ecosystems. So here you can see in Southwest England it's 47%, Warsaw 50%, in Brazil it gets up to 80%, in New York City it's 75%. The fact that such a large proportion of peregrine falcons' diets comes from pigeons testifies to the fact that they are necessary in urban ecosystems and that they play a crucial role in maintaining, not destabilizing that ecosystem. I have this quote here from Stella Capoccia, a researcher on pigeons in urban environments. She says that they could be considered an urban keystone species themselves because of how much of the food chain they make up. And these aren't the only benefits they provide either. Pigeons can act as agents of seed transference between bio-islands. So biological islands are these fractured pieces of territory and habitat that are kind of self-contained. Cities are considered biological islands because they are not really integrated into the surrounding natural ecosystem. In these biological islands, what happens is genetic diversity decreases due to lack of intercommunication with other habitats. Pigeons, because they fly so far and fly so accurately, are able to transfer seeds from city to city, essentially improving biodiversity between these islands and acting as a connective bridge. They also provide us with a lot of important ecosystem services, and an ecosystem services is just something that an animal does that benefits us. So pigeons can serve as bioindicators for a lot of pollutants. That means that if we measure how much of a pollutant exists in their flesh, we can tell how much of it exists in the surrounding ecosystem. This is because they scavenge human trash. So we can tell what's in our trash by telling what's in pigeons. This has been applied to lead concentrations and plastic pollution. Furthermore, the scavenging of pigeons in human trash prevents urban decay. We have a lot less decaying fruits, vegetables, foods because pigeons come and eat them before they turn into these kind of noxious, rotten piles of sludge. They also scare away more intolerable pests. So people hate rats more than they hate pigeons, if you can believe that. And pigeons, by acting as scavengers, kind of ward off rats in all of their environments. They stay and they pick at trash that rats would prefer to have, but scare the rats away into the sewers. So there's a lot to be said for pigeons' role in urban environments, and we essentially can't say that they cause diseases or that they imperil urban ecology. The question then remains, do pigeons have the right to exist within cities by human standards? If we can't justify killing them because they're not harmful to us and they're not harmful to the environment, then this becomes just a question of personal preference, of moral obligation. And I say the answer is yes, pigeons do have the right to exist within cities. Why? Well, they're about as native to cities as we are. We've domesticated pigeons 5,000 years ago, and they have existed throughout the rise of complex civilization. They literally don't know how to exist without us. If you look at this guy's nest, that's not gonna help him in the wild, right? That's 4 sticks and an egg that's not even in the nest. The reason they build nests like this is because the urban architecture of cities, jagged ledges, these tall buildings, mimic their natural environment of sea cliffs and make it easier for them to nest without needing to build nests. Additionally, pigeons depend on us, for their food sources. They live commensally to us, meaning they benefit from our presence, and they cannot really survive without that food source in the wild. Pigeons are also not wild, at least not the ones in cities. Those are feral pigeons, Columba Livia, which are genetically identical to domesticated pigeons that we keep as pets. Feral pigeons in cities are just descendants of pigeons that have been released into the wild in the past. So you can't say, bring the pigeons back to the wild because they never belonged there in the first place. And here are just a few more pictures of pigeon nests to really drive home this point that they're not going to make it in the forests, guys. It's not going to happen. So with all that being said, how can we learn to live harmoniously with pigeons? Of course, we need to consider that they are loud, that their feces can corrode buildings, that nobody wants to be blitzed on the way to a first date or a family reunion while walking down the street, right? Well, one option is installing dovecotes throughout cities. Dovecotes can decrease pigeon population by 50% without necessarily needing to kill anything. So these are images of dovecotes right here. They're little houses for pigeons where they can live, habitate, and reproduce. And they are more attractive than average city ledges or streets because they are protected, they provide food, and they mimic the sea cliff environment that they're native to. So maybe the solution is not, let's keep them away from our space, but let's draw them to another space naturally. Of course, this doesn't affect the root cause of the issue, that we don't want pigeons to exist among us, and maybe we should reconsider that position. I argue that top-down cultural influence through organizations such as museums, media organizations, or cultural institutions like city councils, mixed with grassroots, bottom-up movements of pop culture, can change our social perception of pigeons and lead us towards a more humane cohabitation with them. Here's one example of what top-down institutional influence looks like. This is the logo of the London Museum in London, England, which receives over 400,000 visitors per year. It's a pigeon with, as I'm sure you can tell, a glittery splap of poo coming out of its butt. This might seem odd to a few people, but London reclaiming the pigeon as a symbol of its cultural heritage communicates that pigeons belong in cities just as much as humans do. The same can be said of this 16-foot pigeon statue created by artist Ivan Argote in 2024. This exists in New York City in Highline Plinth Park, and it reasserts the position of pigeons among humans. It says, hey, we're not just these little guys that you want to kick out of your way, we belong here just as much as anyone else. Of course, having museums tell you what to think isn't going to help anyone if it's not accompanied by humans and populations in mass changing their perceptions. And this can be done in a variety of ways. Viral videos, for example, often promote sympathy for pigeons and declare that we have abandoned them. I just the other day saw an edit of pigeons, if you can believe that got over 5 million views. So it seems that there is a meaningful movement of people who are willing to change and reevaluate their perceptions of these pigeons. In order to do my part to help change public perception of pigeons, I'm going to leave you today with a little video of a pigeon, just so you can see how cute they are. They're just like cats or dogs, honestly. And yeah.